Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for Friday, July 20th, 2018. Since 1990, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed commentary on the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now by way of the good folks at Urbana Public Television and YouTube. Earlier editions of the program can be found on archive.org. Our name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who says that in the U.S. media either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things on a party time edition of News from Neptune. I'll begin tonight with a comment on political parties, especially Republicans and Democrats, occasioned by a report in the paper Roll Call this morning. I quote, "House and Senate Democrats are pressuring their Republican colleagues to bring to the floor legislation introduced in response to President Donald Trump's comments and revisions to those comments this week on Russian interference in U.S. elections. Democratic House leaders released a bipartisan package which includes 17 previously introduced bills that would further restrict the White House's foreign policy and economic options when it comes to Moscow. The package, H.R. 6437, has two Republican co-sponsors, including Representative Elise Stefanik of New York, who is chairwoman of the House Armed Services Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee. Stefanik, who quickly emerged as a leader in the Armed Services panel, includes cyber in her subcommittee's portfolio. In the Senate, Democrats, with some assistance from Republican Jeff Flake of Arizona, the well-named Republican, that last comment was an editorial insert that was not in the roll call account. In the Senate, Democrats, with some assistance from Republican Jeff Flake of Arizona, tried to use the unanimous consent process to pass resolutions reaffirming the U.S. intelligence community's findings of Russia's 2016 election interference, but were blocked by other Republicans. Roll call, interestingly, doesn't say who the other Republicans were. While agreeing in principle to some sort of legislative response, Republicans have argued in favor of regular order and the committee markup process, the way the Senate regularly does business. That was in roll call this morning and raises the questions of the peculiar actions of political parties, and even more the questions of what sort of support they should receive from the electorate. But part of the problem arises from the peculiar nature of American political parties. Political parties in other countries are often dues-paying, class-based associations pressing for certain well-defined goals. So you can have, for example, a banker's party, a farmer's party, a working-class party, etc. In contrast, in the United States, parties are brands trying to convince the largest numbers of voters that Coca-Cola is better than Pepsi-Cola, Cheerios is better than Wheaties. Do they still make Wheaties? I'm not even sure.
I don't know.
That's the greatest U.S. crime of the post-World War II world. The U.S. invasion of Southeast Asia, we call it the Vietnam War, was not ended by parties taking different sides, even though by 1969, about 70% of the public had come to regard the Vietnam War as fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake, largely as a result of the impact of student protest on general consciousness. And that mass opposition compelled the business community and then the government to stop the escalation of the war. But the parties, the Republicans and Democrats, were not much involved, and that's a lesson in terms of trying to stop the current war-making by the United States. We may well ask, will the Bush-Obama-Trump depredations on the Mideast be brought to an end as the Kennedy-Johnson-Nixon assaults on Southeast Asia were? The answer is hardly clear. History, has been said, doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Remember that Richard Nixon had a secret plan for ending the Vietnam War. He was the anti-war candidate in 1968, as Trump was in 2016. In each case, their opponents, Hubert Humphrey before, Hillary Clinton afterwards, were leading members of the administrations making war. The Vietnam War ended, to the extent that it did, for three reasons in order of importance. First, the brave resistance of the Vietnamese people against U.S. attack. Two, the revolt of the American Army in Vietnam. If you want to follow that up, look up fragging. The revolt of the Army, which compelled the sudden ending of the U.S. draft in 1973. And finally, the mass opposition of the U.S. public, in fact, the least important of the three factors U.S. that brought the war to an end. When it came to the Mideast, even more important to U.S. government planners than Southeast Asia, U.S. imperial policy was determined to avoid the mistakes of Vietnam. 1. Local resistance in the Mideast was widespread, but divided and inchoate. Note that the 9/11 attacks on New York and Washington were a counterattack to U.S. actions. 2. The U.S. military, the revolt of which was responsible for the ending of the Vietnam War, has been assuaged. The draft has been ended because of U.S. resistance, and only the economic draft was left, so the U.S. fights its Mideast wars largely with foreign proxies, whom it finances, from NATO in Afghanistan to jihadists in Syria, then with drone assassinations. Noam Chomsky points out that Obama's drone program was the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times. 3. The mass opposition of the U.S. public to foreign wars, perhaps never greater than in 2003 with Bush's invasion of Iraq, could be managed with lies and propaganda in the subsequent 15 years. Obama ran as the peace candidate in 2008, you may remember. The anti-war movement that should have countered his lies was seduced by him instead, so in office he could immediately expand the war in Afghanistan that he'd attacked in the campaign. The examples of Vietnam and the Mideast seem to make it clear that an anti-war movement today that actually deters U.S. wars will not be based on the Republican and Democratic organizations. They are together part of the war party that serves the worldwide economic interests of dominant social groups in the U.S., the 1%, not the interests of the population at large, who have had to be misled with ever more fantastic lies, now including Russian aggression and collusion. That's the situation we find the parties in today, and it seems to me that any reasonable way forward in regard to those parties needs to recognize this. You're watching News from Neptune, and I have opened with a screed tonight, but David can comment on that or bring his own list as he wishes.
Well, as we were talking before the show, I was assuming that some of your comments were going to reflect the comments that Glenn Ford made in the last few days on the Black Agenda Report website. And so that's a not too long, but pretty meaty article that he wrote, basically saying, hopefully the two parties will implode into one party, into one small sort of war party, corporate party, the two major parties, that is, leaving the so-called progressive Democrats and the libertarian Republicans to form more solid parties of their own, or even a socialist party, or given the meteoric rise of the Democratic Socialist of America Party. I mean, they're using figures like 400, 500%, meaning in numerical terms, which matter. Okay, 10,000 to 40,000 people. That's a big deal, but it's still only 40,000 people. That's a drop in the bucket in terms of the citizenry in this country. But anyway, that's what Glenn Ford is arguing in terms. He likes to talk about the white man's party, the Republican Party, the establishment of the Republican Party being the white man's party, because we always need a white man's party in this country, and the Democrats are playing the role of the minority group party, but they're still the corporate party. They're just hoping that the people, the liberal people, the some of the working class people, the minority people who can't stomach the more blatant racism of the Republican Party will still have no choice but to vote for Democrat, whether it's Hillary Clinton or and so forth. So that's worth reading, and also worth reading while you're at. Actually, I originally went to the Black Agenda Report website because you had referenced Bruce Dixon's column about where's the Green Party in all of this. And then I saw that, I read that article, and I read Glenn Ford's article, and there are many good counterpoints to the nonsense that we've been seeing for the last few days. So there, yeah.
It's party time in America, no question. But the parties and the presumed positions of the parties seem to me to be fantastic in the literal sense of the word.
Yeah.
That is, they're a matter of fantasy and have very little to do with the real politics of the United States, specifically in regard to foreign wars, which continue as they have for more than a generation, and the parties are finally irrelevant. What's happened, I think, in some ways, is that this party structure, which means that Republicans and Democrats and other interests in the American government together make up a war party that has continued with minor variations, war provocations against notably Russia and China, East and West, war provocations that are extremely dangerous and that depend finally very little on what should be the political discussion going on in this country. That's why it's party time, because the parties are irrelevant. They've been folded into the war party. And the shakeup was the candidacy of Donald Trump. When Trump ran for president, he became the first major party candidate, the first war party candidate, if you like, to attack the notion of American wars and interventions in 40 years. The policy of the United States, the war policy of the United States, was based upon neoliberal and neoconservative political positions that were accepted by all recent political parties, all recent political administrations. And the criticism of those positions, including criticism of the Iraq War and of interventions in the Middle East that Trump offered, were hardly believed or hardly noticed by the political establishment because it ran so counter to what had been the case for 40 years. But Americans did notice that, and there's some very interesting survey data that shows the way in which Trump's criticism of the Bush-Obama wars actually produced votes for him, produced his election, because those people who had voted for Obama, for example, stayed home and didn't vote for Hillary on the war issue. This is important, and the fact that this was opened up by Trump was the basis for the absolutely hysterical campaign of Russiagate that we've seen since the election. If you had told me 5 years ago, a year ago, even a year ago, that we would have something like the Russiagate nonsense coming from Democrats and Republicans across the board, and these absolutely fantastic and historically unbased claims about the dangers of Russian aggression and the failures of Donald Trump, who must be a Russian puppet of some sort, to respond to the imminent threat of Russia, I would have said you were nuts. I still say you're nuts, as a matter of fact, if you believe any of that. But it is quite remarkable. And as this account of what went on in the Senate this morning that I started with shows, the matter is a clear and present danger to the United States.
Yeah, I've been only lightly reading the mainstream media in these matters and relying
Trying to hold on to your
more on
sanity,
the
are you, David?
well, I read Thomas Friedman's column, and
I
it
thought
was
it.
really pretty classic Thomas Friedman bombast about it's entertaining in its own strange way that how
Yeah.
when Thomas Friedman gets his chest all puffed up and his patriotic juices flowing and he's accused, but it's typical of what's been being reported or being commented on in the New York Times or Washington Post. I don't listen to NPR, so I don't really know how it's being covered there. I assume in a similar way. But just to sort of complicate things, I've been watching, as usual, the Real News Network and reading on the internet, reading Counterpunch and some other left wing sources. But just to complicate the issue here, what actually the journalist Aaron Mate, who's hosts a lot of the interviews on the Real News Network, was interviewed on the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast by Kevin Gostola and Ronnie Akalik just in the last day or two, and he took pains to point out beyond all that, and let's complicate things, a little bit here in terms of what the supposed anti-war or less aggressive policies of the Trump administration have been, and he pointed out that that in some ways, I can't elaborate on this, but maybe you can. Trump has been far more hawkish on Russia than Barack Obama was. That Trump bombed Syria, killing Russian mercenaries there. That Trump pulled out of the Iran deal. That Trump is sending arms to Ukraine, whereas Obama did not, albeit the coup was fostered while Obama was president. Aaron didn't note that. And again, noting that a new member was added to NATO during Trump, as during the Obama era. That Trump is holding massive, and I'm quoting this, I wrote this I'd sort of transcribed this as I was listening to it this morning, that Trump is holding massive war games on Russia's borders, that Trump has imposed new sanctions on Russia, and that the national security strategy, the sort of official Trump doctrine, supposedly, calls Russia, quoting Aaron Mate, a greater threat than terrorism. So those, and this is to debunk the notion, on the one hand, debunk the notion that Trump is Putin's puppet, or on the one hand, you have to debunk the notion that Putin that we need a new Cold War, but on the other hand, you have to debunk the notion, according to these sort of bullet points, that Trump really has been particularly sort of peace-minded. But beyond that, and I think Aaron would say that the behavior of Trump at least shows that he wants to avoid nuclear war. He at least wants to avoid ratcheting things up in a clear way. That he wants to actually keep in contact. He wants that Trump doesn't accept this notion that Russia is anything but a global competitor in terms of trade and so forth, rather than this sort of military enemy. So that's his effort to sort of at least complicate the situation in a certain way, beyond all the usual points that they made about how the media is covering the Trump-Putin summit and this business about subpoenaing the woman who was the interpreter there, the only other person on earth who knows what it is actually that Trump and Putin said to each other in their private chat.
I have great respect for Aaron Mate. I think he's done some remarkable work recently in terms of getting people to talk and asking uncomfortable questions and so forth. I am a little skeptical, though, of this notion that, well, after all, Trump is just as bad in terms of pressing towards war as Obama, in spite of what you may have heard. I don't think that's true, and the reason for that is that we make a big mistake, I think, when we concentrate on Trump's psychology, Trump derangement syndrome, it's been called, and not about the policies of the United States government. One of the things that's clear about the Trump administration is that Trump is perhaps the weakest American president. I've suggested, working my way back, trying to find the weak sister. Sorry, that's the phrase. In the earlier times, and coming to Calvin Coolidge as the last American president who had less direct control of his administration than Trump does. What Trump is doing, in some ways, in things like these important diplomatic transformations with North Korea and indeed with Moscow, is fighting off the weakness with the one thing that he's got, the question of whom he can go to, whom he can talk to, whom he can see. That's what has brought the Singapore and Helsinki about. Trump has very little control over the government. And the second point against what Mattei seemed to be suggesting is that the movement of the most belligerent group in the American government and the American state, from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party during the campaign, from the Trump campaign to the Clinton campaign. I'm speaking of the neocons. The movement of this group, which is vicious but politically aware, grew out specifically of their outrage and fear when Trump began talking non-intervention. Yeah. So what we have here is a situation in which the American government is, I don't like to use the phrase deep state because it takes some explanation, but it seems to me that when we talk about the American government, the permanent government, as some people say, what the American government does as a whole, we've got to realize that most of that government was not only opposed but horrified at Trump's departure from the neoliberal and neoconservative verities of the earlier administrations. Second point, Obama was a warmonger. Obama, whose psychology perhaps should be examined even more closely than Trump's psychology, because Obama was better at it, Obama was very good at masking what he did, at hiding what he did from the world at large. In fact, if one wants to get psychobiographical about this, one can say that Obama's entire life was a matter of hiding who and what he was from the people that he wished to impress and whom he wanted favors from. That's a line that I regret opening, but still in all. The point is that Obama's actual political warmongering policies were awful. We forget, I'm astonished the way in which we talk about Putin seizing Crimea. That's about as reasonable as saying the Second World War started because Russia seized Poland. It's backwards. It's upside down. It's wrong. What actually happened was that the Obama administration, in some of the most belligerent actions, but in fine Obama fashion, covertly, seduced a government or seduced a movement in the Ukraine to overthrow a legally elected president and establish a government, the first government in Europe since the Second World War actually to have neo-Nazis participate, to have Nazi members. This is the government Obama put the Obama administration put into Ukraine, and the reason that the Russian troops, which are already present, of course, in Crimea, in the great Russian naval base at Sevastopol, the Russian troops produced a situation in which a plebiscite in Crimea was overwhelming vote to not to submit to the government established by the U.S. coup in Kiev. Crimea says, no, we don't want that. We don't want the government that has been replaced the elected government in Kiev, and the Russians said, we'll support that with the troops that we have in Crimea. That is a matter of self-determination, at least as vigorous, at least as justifiable as the independence of Kosovo. But this is part of the story that never gets into the American discussion. What we hear, as we did in the Senate this morning, was, well, Putin seized Crimea, and he's got to be resisted, and we've got to use all the resources at our command, including threats of war, to resist Russian aggression. Hard to find something that's more upside down than that. But that's the sort of thing that we've been hearing. And as I say, I'm astonished as can be at the way in which this story has gotten reversed for American propaganda purposes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Aaron Mate was. First of all, he didn't do any speculating into Trump's brain or motives to suggest that in a few cases, the policies, there's basic continuity between the Obama and Trump policies in certain ways, and I think he was just trying to make more than he was just trying to make the point that the elite point of view now is that Trump has somehow given up the game, and to a certain extent he has, but to a minor extent, because all the structural deep state, whatever you want to call it, functions remain in place.
Exactly.
And they influence some aspect of what Trump is either doing or can't do because of those things. But I think, ultimately, just Trump is driving all these people crazy because he doesn't, on the one hand, not so much because of what he does or what he can do, but he clearly doesn't speak the kind of, referring to what you said about Obama, the kind of slick geopolitical language that and of course he's being criticized for bumbling along and reversing himself and saying, "Oh, I meant would not when I said would," and so on and so forth. And I mean, these are pretty weak reasons to think that Trump actually has an idea to make a genuine peace with us and the rest of the world. Okay, there I'm getting into Trump's head, but there just isn't any reason to believe that there's been a serious change in the structural geopolitical relationships between the major powers.
The reason there hasn't been any serious change, of course, is that the deep state is in control, that the permanent government is in control, and even when there are threats to move that control in the direction of peace and against the warmongering of the Bush and Obama administrations, the permanent government snaps back. And we get this whole notion that we've got to impeach Trump. Trump is crazy. Look at what he's doing, so forth and so on. And a more honest affirmation of the U.S. remarkable belligerence against Russia than we've had in a long time. Sorting this out is going to take some work, but it's the essential steps are, one, recognizing the vicious war provocations of the last administration, even though they pretended they weren't, and two, the continuance of those war provocations against the greater attempt of the Trump administration to say there's something wrong with them. And that's where the argument is going right now. It's precisely because, you might say, that Trump did say there's something wrong with American war provocations, that those war provocations have had to be reasserted much more vigorously as they were in the Senate this morning. So the situation is desperate but not serious, as they say.
Yeah.
Right?
A little aside to this, I ran across an article. There's a lot of people to read, and sometimes I don't read. Sometimes you get in the habit of reading people that you feel are sort of reliable, and not spending time reading someone who you never heard of. And there is a guy who is published on Counterpunch, and I'm recalling his name from memory. I think it's Dan Corjescu, Corjescu, something like that. Mm-hmm. And he had an article in the last couple of days. I just happened to, I was intrigued by the title. I can't remember what it was. It was about Russia. It was about the history of Russian, it turned out to be about the history of the end of the Soviet Union and the Americans' role in that. And of course, when we talk about the Americans' role in that, we usually talk about Afghanistan and the Russians in Afghanistan and the manner in which it weakened the Soviet Empire and Gorbachev came into power and so forth. But what he pointed out, something I hadn't really heard of before, and that is that there were contacts between the people that became the Russian oligarchs. I'm just repeating this. I don't know for a fact anywhere what the sources are, what the primary sources are for any of these claims, but that the Russian oligarchs there already was American corporations or American oligarchs or whatever reaching out, or I don't know if it was in the American state or financial aspects or whatever, were reaching out to those people in the Soviet Union who stood to gain from the end of the Soviet Union and in the fact that the state-owned enterprises were basically handed over to the people who became the handful, 7, 8, 10, 12, whatever it was, of the Russian oligarchs in terms of that. So the point of this article was to say that the wheels were being greased in the mid-'80s with some of these relationships, some of these back channel things that were going on, and that these people, what the relationship was between these people, these oligarchs, and the end of the Soviet Union, and how that all played out in relation to Gorbachev and Glasnost and Perestroika and all that stuff. I don't know, but I had just never heard that claim before. It just reinforced the notion that neoliberalism has a plan. It always has a plan.
Yes, exactly.
And Russia was seen as a part of that plan.
Right.
And the question is, why, given Putin's willingness, given the fact that Putin really represents the interests of these people, but maybe obviously doesn't play ball quite in the way that Boris Yeltsin, who we basically put into power, did. But what is it? But that Trump sees Putin and the other Russian oligarch people that he's dealt with in his own private life as guys like us, people like us. So yes.
No, it seems to me that what you say is true here in terms of the various interests involved with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I think the important thing with Trump is not his internal reflections, not his psychology.
No, I'm not talking about that. I never talk about Trump's psychology.
I see. Okay. I'll make a note of that.
I'm not one of those people.
I'll make a note of that. A footnote, perhaps, to what we've said so far concerns Montenegro. I know Montenegro is always top of your list of places you want to talk about.
Absolutely.
But it seems to me that a peculiar key to what's going on in the American government right now was provided by Montenegro last week, when the suggestion was made that Montenegro should simply be welcomed into NATO. Trump, back from a trip to Brussels in which he criticized NATO, and this criticism was always presented in this country in terms of money, whether NATO is spending enough on defense and so forth. What Trump actually said was, Why do we want Montenegro in NATO? Montenegro would become a NATO member, and the whole structure of NATO says that if one country in NATO is attacked, all the other countries must come to its defense. Trump says, what are we doing here? Are we saying that Montenegro can bring all of Europe and the U.S. to war by producing a political crisis somewhere? That's crazy, says Trump, and NATO is obsolete. Now, this is eminent sense. This is exactly right, but that was hardly reported in this country at all. And it was reported in terms of, Trump as Putin's puppet probably really isn't interested in defending NATO anymore. This is treason. Yeah. That's the way the American mainstream media reported it, and yet Trump's comment is eminent sense.
He must have been thinking of World War I. Oh, wait, I can't say what he was thinking.
So. You're watching news from Neptune, and we are sounding more Neptunish than usual today, I think, because we're talking about the nonsense that's being said about politics, particularly international politics, by the American parties, by the most important party in America, the most important political party, which is, of course, the War Party. The party that presses for war provocations against Russia and China, and is made up of the Pentagon, the intelligence community. I always feel I have to wash my mouth out after saying that. I mean the CIA, the NSA, and so forth. The neocons, the theoretical warmongers in the American government and American think tank land, and the other interests that have supported a belligerent American foreign policy for more than a century, actually, but that continue to exist in Washington, and we can't see the forest for the trees. We can't see the War Party because we're saying, well, is that the Republicans, or is that the Democrats, or is it somebody else, or is there an important difference between the Republicans and the Democrats? There's not. There's an American War Party that has been producing wars around the world, and has killed more than 20 million people in those wars since the Second World War in order to maintain American worldwide economic dominance. There is only one enemy that the War Party fears, and that's the American public, the anti-war American public. The public, the American public, that it has to be lied to and coerced into all the 20th century wars by the United States, because the American public recognized that those wars were not in their interest. They were in the interest only of the economic elite in the United States, and that continues to be the case down to our own day. Now, in a situation like that, we can only expect, I think, lies and misrepresentations from our political leaders, with very rare exceptions. And
it's funny, the critique or the little poking at the phrase intelligence community.
Yeah.
I recall the first person who ever pointed that out in a kind of a jaundiced way, saying, community, you're trying to kind of soften it up and like communities, a school, a church, whatever. And that person was actually, strangely enough, William Safire.
Oh, yes.
Well, maybe somebody pointed out before him,
he
but I remember
idiot,
30 years ago or whatever, reading his on language column in the New York Times. He pointed out the manner in which that language was being used to kind of soften the meaning of this machine, of this system that operates. And speaking of which, might want to drop in here. And I had not known about the relationship between the University of Illinois Chicago and the CIA, which Francis Boyle has been talking about the last few days in relation to bringing the John Marshall private law school to the public, to be associated as a public law school with the University of Illinois Chicago, UIC. So that's rather fascinating. It's kind of interesting when it's a good thing that something that is private becomes public, as opposed to something public becoming private. But whatever it is, the News Gazette, I'm pretty sure, thinks it's a great idea, or for some reason, I don't know, because we're all proud of our public universities, even though they become increasingly private. And of course, they don't have a problem with the CIA having this. I really had not known this. Had you known this deal that the CIA has with just openly working with UIC to sort of interest students and getting involved with that? Obviously, that's the kind of thing that was being vociferously opposed 50 years ago, which I guess now is just standard operating procedure.
I think that's right. It's clear who won.
Yes. Not quote unquote us.
Yes, not us.
Yeah.
You're watching News from Neptune. We have. Do we have other matters we need to turn to? You have things on your list?
I have one. Well, the one thing, continuing a little bit, Aaron Mate also interviewed Professor Asad Abu Khalil, known as the Angry Arab, because is what he calls his blog. He doesn't blog much anymore. Unfortunately, I kind of missed that. He's gone over to Facebook, and I haven't followed him there. But I picked out a couple of paragraphs. It's a two-part interview, maybe a total of about 25 minutes, in which wide-ranging. And I picked out a couple of things that, again, might sort of complicate an understanding of what the relationship between the United States and Russia, especially regarding Iran, Israel, and so forth. So a little bit out of context, but let me just read these couple of paragraphs of what he said and what Assad said in response to Aaron Mate's questions. First paragraph. Well, there's no doubt that Putin is a strong ally of the state of Israel, and I have always been critical of the way the so-called resistance camp in the Middle East has been deceived, I think, by the intentions of the Russian government in Syria. I think their role in Syria has more to do with the Russian calculations in the world vis-a-vis the United States and Europe, and much less to do with the calculations of their allies, their temporary allies in Syria and beyond in the Middle East region. What Trump said in the interview yesterday, that would have been earlier this week, confirmed what we already know, that Putin is a very close ally of the state of Israel. And in fact, Netanyahu today is capitalizing on this advantageous sponsorship and support he receives from both Trump and Putin in order to increase the stance or posture of Israel in the Middle East region. Okay, that's one little clump. Do you want to?
Can I comment on that?
Yeah, sure.
I think that's important.
Yeah.
I think that's right, but I think we should look at what Putin's interest is in supporting Israel to the extent that it does. This is difficult for us to see in this country because our vision of what Israel is and does is itself already so corrupted that it's difficult to see how the matter looks from someplace else. Why would Putin want to support Israel or at least take Israel's views into account in regard to Syria, which is what's being discussed? To understand that, I think you have to understand why Russia got involved in Syria in the first place. Remember, the Syrian war began when the Obama administration hired the nastiest jihadists it could find and sent them into Syria in order to overthrow the secular, democratically elected Syrian government. Now, the U.S. wanted to do that because it wanted to reduce Syria, an oil producer in the Middle East, to the forms of control the U.S. has tried to exercise in the Middle East for generations. The U.S. started the war against Syria, the international war against Syria, in this fashion. Russia came to the aid of Syria, which is a Middle Eastern ally of the U.S., but the major reason Russia was concerned about Syria was that the jihadists that the U.S. had hired to attack Syria threatened Russia. Look at a map and understand how fanatic Muslim terrorists have a direct route into Russia, where indeed the country has had a great deal of difficulty with fanatic Muslim terrorists. It was pure self-protection on Russia's part to aid Syria in putting down the jihadist revolt that the United States had started. Now, under those circumstances, it seems to me that Russia would have reason for supporting forces in the Middle East that could put down this sort of insurgency before it spreads to Russia, if you like. I think if you look at this from the point of view of Moscow, it makes a good deal more sense rather than the account that the U.S. gives of how Russia and the U.S. are at loggerheads in Syria, and what we should do, of course, is establish no-fly zones over Syria to keep the Russians from overrunning that country, the sort of thing that the Democrats wanted to do in the last election.
Yeah. But at part of the conversation, I mean, this relates somewhat to the conversation I think we've been having on the peace list the last week or two regarding whether Russia is going to betray Iran at some point.
Yeah.
And so let me just read one other paragraph here, sort of with that had to do with that question, or what the ongoing relationship of Russia and Iran is going to be. And to this, Asad Abu Khalil says, "Will the Russians restrain Iran in Syria? I am sure the Iranians, if they are to retreat from Syria altogether or partially, they're going to extract the price in return. They are not going to do that for free. But the notion that the Israelis or the Russians are going to be able to interrupt lines of support from Iran through Iraq and Syria and all the way to Hezbollah is a fantasy. It's not going to happen under the most difficult circumstances of the war. It's not going to happen. Under the most difficult circumstances of the war, the line of supply continued. And Hezbollah was fighting really not so much for the Syrian regime, which is its ally or ally in recent years, because there was a history of enmity between them, but also for the supply line for their own survival as a potent military or organization standing against Israeli aggression and occupation.
I think once again we have to look at this from the point of view of the Russian government. The overall threat that the Russian government faces is the United States' century-long attempt to make sure that there is no economic integration and progress in Eurasia as a whole. And by Eurasia a whole, I mean from Iran to China. And Russia is in the midst of this, as people have pointed out once again for a century, and that the U.S. attempts, the U.S. has 1,000 military bases ringing Russia and China and Iran. Look at the map and see how it works. And the reason for that is precisely the long-term American attempt to make sure that Eurasia does not get organized in an economic and political fashion that would exclude the U.S. from exploiting Eurasia. That goes back to the open door policy in 1899. That's what that argument, that unfortunate argument with the Japanese in the 1940s was about. The problem is the Japanese threatened to organize that area and exclude the U.S. No, says the U.S., you can't do it, and we're going to kill a lot of people to make sure that you don't do it. Now, these are continuities of American policy that are based on trying to prevent the association of peer competitors, that is, countries that in some ways are equal to us in Europe and Asia. If you want to see this set out in theoretical terms, quite explicitly, read Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard. More than a decade old, it nevertheless describes this continuity of American policy, which means that Russia has no interest in abandoning Iran, but the U.S., which overthrew an elected Iranian government in 1953, has a great deal of interest in breaking up these Eurasian conjunctions. The unthinkable occurred in the recent entente, the recent understanding between China and Russia, and Iran is included in that. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is the general name for this sort of Asian NATO that the U.S. is so concerned about breaking up. And therefore, the U.S. supports Israel and Israel's hostility to Iran in order to make sure that the that Iran will not thrive. The U.S. has been torturing Iran for 60 years to make sure that it does not thrive and incorporate itself into the Eurasian economic integration, represented now by Russian-Chinese understanding, and even the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which goes through Iran. The U.S. is determined that this is not going to happen, and as I say, we're willing to kill a lot of people to make sure that it doesn't happen.
No, no comeback for that one, but we prove we're willing to kill lots of people.
We have a couple of minutes left. Do you have another point you want to bring up?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Right? Well, first of all, let me remind people, because I just dropped in William Safire's name there. Probably deserves to be said. He was one of Nixon's speechwriters. Right. He was,
responsible for the wonderful phrase, the nattering nabobs of negativism.
Was it? You mean he wrote that?
He wrote that for Spiro Agnew.
Okay, I did not know that. Well, I can forgive him for that. I mean, not a nice person, but anyway.
But occasionally funny.
But yeah, right.
And if you can't have one, you might as well have the other, right?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a good sort of interesting interview with another reliable observer regarding Israel, a guy named Shir Hever, who actually lives in Germany. As a lot of smart people seem to move to Germany these days in order to be smart, because they can't be smart where they're in their home countries. But anyway, it's about this law that has been passed by the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, which is sort of makes official that Israel, like within the Green Line, within the 1967 pre-1967 boundaries of Israel, is sort of officially an apartheid state, and if you don't like it, too bad. And
actually, more than that, isn't it, David? I mean, it's not just officially an apartheid state, but officially a racist state, in the sense that the only real citizens of Israel are people who can show an ancestry unbesmirched from the sources of the Jewish populace.
Yeah, and it reflects the fact that from the start, Israel has not been a state of its citizens. It's been termed the state of the Jewish people, and they've affirmed this in various ways because of the arguments being made, the accusations of Israel as being an apartheid state. The United Nations, finally recognized in a more formal way that Israel was denying the basic rights of its Palestinian citizens, not regardless of set aside the Palestinians in the occupied territories in Gaza, and so forth. But Shir Hever is always a good commenter on these matters. Just one of these young guys who seems to know, have a good sort of sociological insight into things that are going on in his home country. Interesting
contradictions, to put no finer point on it, built into that nation law that Israel passed this week. although, as you say, the point is to say that the state of Israel is the state of the Jewish people worldwide, they're very interested, surprisingly enough, in excluding people who claim to be Jews but have dark skins.
Yes.
There's some embarrassments around Ethiopian Jews and others who say, okay, here we are, we're part of the Jewish people worldwide. No, you aren't, says Israel as a whole, in spite of the contradiction built into their own view. Secondly, our own mentor, Noam Chomsky, points out that for all this talk of apartheid, it is probably the case that it's still not quite so bad in Israel proper as it was in South Africa and in apartheid South Africa. But, says Chomsky, in the occupied territories, it's much, much worse. Apartheid in the occupied territories is a more vicious system even than South Africa ran before before the liberation there. Now, that's interesting and important, and it shows the way in which the apartheid discussion works into the general politics of the state of Israel, the internal politics of the state of Israel. And I don't think you have to be too committed to the notion that the U.S. wants to support apartheid in Israel. It's part of the package. The U.S. wants Israel as its stationary aircraft carrier in the Middle East, and if the Israelis want to practice apartheid, hey, that's their trip. That's sort of the way the U.S. has felt for years, and I'm not sure the new nation law changes it much.
Yeah, by the way, that interview with Sherhever I referred to is on the Real News Network.
We will put links to the interviews we've talked about tonight and the various articles. I think I have notes on. We get all of them on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. You have been watching News from Neptune for Friday, July 20th, 2018. Our program is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scollery, and now by I'll put that on the website too. Our thanks for research to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson. No's notes are found on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. Now, this is Carl Estabrook with David Green saying, Inshallah, we will be back next week to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere from The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what's to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.